Hi, I'm Angela Wolf. We are still going on with our sew along, and in this episode we are going to sew the collar and the collar band. And this might be the scariest part, and I'm going to try to take the scare out of it. It's not that difficult. So what I have here, this is my collar, my under and my upper collar. There, I already have the interfacing on there, and what you see here is a chalk mark. Now, your pattern, I don't know what your seam allowance is on your pattern, so you have to check your particular pattern. But what I've done here for this seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, and I've marked it. And the reason is we're gonna sew the collar, we're gonna stitch down, I'm gonna give you a little trick at the end to make a nice point, and then we're gonna go all the way down. Now, I'm only gonna sew half of the collar so we can keep rolling. You'll get the idea though. So the first thing you're gonna do is line up the edge of your collar. So this would be this curved edge. This is the bottom of your collar, and this is the outside edge of your collar. And I'm just gonna stitch down, and when I get to the end, about this far, I'm about maybe half an inch from the end, I'm lowering the stitch length to 1.4, 1.2, something really narrow. Go almost all the way to the end, turn it. I can see where my point is, which I'll point this out in a second because you probably can't see it under the sewing machine. Go 1 or 2 stitches on a curve on this angle, okay? And now I'm going to flip it again. And I'm basically right on that blue chalk mark now. I'm going a few stitches, and then we're going back up to a 2.5. I know that's a lot of steps, but what that does is when you go to turn your collar right side out, what you're gonna see here, if you push too hard, number one, you won't get a good point, and the other thing is you don't want to pop anything out of it. So end up with a big hole. So what I have here, if you can't see the stitching, I'm sorry, it's white on white. I stitched right here, about right here, I went to little stitches, I did a little cross here, little stitches, and then back to large. Now, because this pattern, now I would stitch all the way around, so just to make clear, I'm only doing part of this for you. You really want a shorter seam allowance in there. Can you imagine turning this right side out and having all that fabric? So if your pattern already had that, don't worry about it. When I get to the end, I'm just gonna trim off like this. And notice I hold my scissors on a little bit of an angle. And what's that's doing is, it's just a slight difference in the seam allowance right there. So let's go to press for a minute. And I'm only gonna press once, but you're gonna be doing a lot of pressing when you work on this. This is called a press point. If you don't have this, don't worry, you could just press as well. But what I'm gonna do is use my fingers to open that seam allowance up. Do a little pressing. And this does very similar to the tailor's clapper. The wood and the steam mix, and it ends up opening this seam allowance, and it just makes your collar look so much better. All right, so now we don't have all that fabric, and I'm just gonna stick my finger in here and flip it right side out. And then the next step you would do is to give this a good pressing. Use your tailor's clapper to keep that nice and crisp. And let's go sit back down. I have another collar, and I'm gonna show you how to top stitch. So here I have one that's already finished. I've already pressed this around, and this is just extra threads at each corner. And you'll see, depending on what sewing machine you have, you might have difficulty at the corners. So I've stitched, this is just a basting stitch across the bottom to keep the upper and under collar together. Change your stitch length to whatever you're using for top stitching. This time I'll use a 3.5, and I'm going to stitch very close to the end. I'm lining this edge up right on the inside of my foot there. And I'm going to use this pen. This is a fabric marking pen. Just give myself a 45-degree angle. This is so much easier. So when I get to the end of this collar, my needle will go in right where that purple is, and I know when I turn it, my edge is lining right up again. If it's not, turn it back around and give yourself one more stitch. 2 things here. You have a black button on your machine that you could utilize, and that will keep your foot nice and straight. Or you could use these threads to pull just a little bit to get it started. If you've ever stitched on the top, the corner like that, and you end up with a bunch of little stitches and all your other stitches look great, that's how you prevent that. So you can either give this a tug or use that black button. So that's one row of top stitching, and you can do a second, whatever you want to do. All right, the next thing I have is the collar band. Your collar's finished. You give it a nice pressing. Here's my 2 rows of stitching. So here's my collar band. It's 2 pieces. And what I've done here is I've drawn in the seam allowance, okay? And now I'm gonna just go through here and stitch this right to the collar. And depending on your seam allowance, I'm only gonna do half. So there, and now take your other piece and line it up. So basically you're sandwiching these together, but the big thing is you really don't want to put them on at the same time because it's a different curve. They're both different curves and you want to make sure that it's lining up. All right, so what you have here, you would do the whole thing and then you would press this down. Notice I left this open. So let's go back to the shirt up here and let me show you something. Here is the collar that I just showed you. And what I've done is I've stitched this to the right side of the fabric. I know it seems weird, but I've also pressed under the seam allowance. So I will stitch this to the whole part of the shirt, the neckline, and then I will turn this right inside. Once that's stitched, you turn this to the inside, and you can stitch around like that. So that's how easy it is to stitch the collar and attach it to your shirt. And in the next step, we're going to work on the placket.